All right, we're back. And so there are some stereotypes that we all sort of assume about sex differences in detecting emotions. And there's been a lot of debate about whether those stereotypes are based in reality or those are stereotypes that are just sort of sexist or whatever. So research has basically shown over and over and over again since people have started studying this question that women do really honestly read emotional cues more easily than men do. So, for one thing, what we mean by more easily is that they tend to be more accurate in their detection. I've got this study from 2000 where they showed a bunch of Ekman style faces, made up facial expressions, right, trying to convey the different emotions, and the women were more accurate in that task than the men were. Other researchers have also shown that the women are faster at making those assessments, and so even if in some studies the difference is in accuracy is non-significant, and so they go, oh look, there are no differences in male and female emotional cue interpretation. But if you factor in speed, suddenly you see that it does matter. All right, I see that I created my PowerPoints too big, and so my face is blocking some of the reference. So I'll just go ahead and pull myself out of there. You don't need to see me anymore anyway. You saw me, that was the end of the quarter. All right, so even when they find that there's no difference in accuracy, they still persist in the faster detection. And so that's an important difference. I mean, if you're faster, that's going to be meaningful, right? And even if it's milliseconds of fasterness, I don't know if that's a word, it can be meaningful because it allows a person to assess the situation a little bit more quickly and react appropriately, more likely. Some people have argued that these sex differences might be a function of evolution. One thing that they have looked at really heavily, and I put little footnotes so you would see which study is making which claims. One argument is that because of women's, ancestral history of caring for babies who can't speak and have to convey their, desires and whatever just through body posture, facial expressions, things like that, that females are just a little bit more primed to pick up on, especially certain emotions like, for example, we have these cues for hunger, right? Parents who can pick up on those hunger cues faster end up with a baby who's not in the full late cue, frantically crying. Now they can't even eat because they're so upset that they had to, get to this phase. And so if you can catch them when they're just starting to show signs of the emotion of hunger, which for babies is called an emotion, then you can feed them before they get so frantic that they can't be fed. Now, no. This is not to say that each individual woman is born with the ability to make these kinds of detections. It usually takes some experience with your own babies to start figuring this out. So the argument isn't that from the beginning, females are born already able to understand babies and therefore can understand emotions. That's not what the argument is. But we do see across the literature that these sex differences emerge pretty early as far as accuracy and then also speed. So it's something that maybe the female brain is primed for differently than the male brain on average. And of course, I always, whenever I talk about sex differences, have to make sure that I'm clarifying these are averages. So any individual who's listening to this right now, this may not describe them. You may have a female who's awful at reading emotions, and you may have a male who's awesome at it. And so the exceptions don't disprove the rule. What we're looking at is averages, right? And so for any individual, I can't make a prediction, but I can say on average, women are better at detecting emotions. One explanation for that might be because of their ancestral history of being responsible for raising children. An angry male face is recognized more efficiently, and this is especially by males. And again, this might be an evolutionary benefit. Ancestral history of being the person who needs to defend or who has to fight, it might be in your best interest as a male to be able to recognize the signs of anger more quickly. Angry male face is recognized more efficiently by males. Females are equally good at detecting both and are faster than males. So it's a little bit of a mixed result. Females are still better at recognizing anger, but for them, it doesn't matter which face is displaying anger. Females are a little bit, but not, it's kind of like that little bit better if you have the, on the texts, if you have the congruent message, it's like way better for interpretation. But if you have the incongruent and it's a negative message, it's like slightly better if with the emoticon. That's slightly better. It's like females are a little bit faster when detecting angry male faces than they are at angry female faces. Again, that's an evolutionary explanation. Historically, across ancestral history, angry males have been a bigger risk to the survival of females than angry females have been. So on average, our ancestors are more likely to be people who were able to accurately recognize an angry male face. Historically, angry females are not as big of a threat to either males or to females as an angry male is. And so being able to recognize that face is really adaptive. And that may have been passed down from those of us who, our ancestors. All of us who exist today are the descendants of ancestors who didn't get, murdered by an angry person who our ancestor didn't recognize was angry, right? Like we're all the result of a person who made a good decision and got away or fought or whatever. And so being able to recognize that this male face is angry more quickly than this female face is angry, that's probably adaptive for both males and for females. But you can think especially for females, it's really an advantage to recognize when a male is angry and either get away, soothe the anger or whatever it takes to, not be victimized. So it might be an evolutionary difference that we're seeing. There's a lot of pressure to make everything be socialized. Like we teach women to, from the time they're little girls to behave this way and boys to behave that way. But one of the things with emotions is that they appear so young, right? With preschoolers displaying some of these differences, that it's really hard to imagine that it's purely socialized. There's probably a predisposition to one extent or another that facilitates us acquiring these things. Women tend to be more empathic is another factor. And what that means is that they report and they also display in controlled studies they're more likely to, cry when someone else is crying. Anyone who's listening to me who cries at movies recognizes you don't know that person. You got swept up by the story and now you're empathizing with the character's plight. And that's why you're crying at a movie or you're angry during a movie or whatever you're feeling. On average, women are more empathic like that. They're more likely to take on the emotion of someone else. They cry in happiness for someone else's success. They, feel a swell of pride, or what Ekman calls fiero, right? More likely when somebody that they know or love has had a success. So women tend to be more empathic. But what I wanted to focus on was the results from Whittle's study on the neural correlates. I just got done talking about maybe some of these things might be evolutionarily selected for. And if that's true, that would mean that our brains are organized in such a way that females may on average behave differently than males do, right? So there are 4 different areas of emotion processing that Whittle et al. Looked at. And they did a giant meta-analysis of all the different neuroimaging studies that had been published by 2011 for them to be able to do this analysis. And if you see a white arrow with a black outline pointing up, that means that's an area of the brain that is more active in females during that kind of emotion processing. If it's a black arrow pointing up, that means that's males are more active during that kind of emotion processing. And then the only time you see any downward arrow would be for the males. So it's a black arrow pointing down. That means that the males have a decrease in activity in that region. And so in emotion perception, what we see is that males have increased activity in their frontal lobe when they're perceiving an emotion and in their parietal lobe, whereas females have increased activity in their limbic system and their subcortical regions, and then also in their temporal lobe. They kind of, for whatever reason in this diagram, put the temporal lobe like we're looking, well, I guess because they cut it and we can see the corpus callosum right there. So the temporal lobe is on the back of the picture. So you see the little bit of it peeking out at the bottom. That's the temporal lobe. It's colored blue. So So we see like different areas of the brain being invoked by males and by females to interpret somebody else's emotion. Emotion reactivity, what we see is the same areas of the brain are being utilized, but depending on the sex of the observer, we see different kinds of emotion triggering different increases in activity. So for females, we see increases when the emotion that's being stimulated is fear. And for males, we tend to see increases when we see these positive kinds of emotions, when we see dominance. So when they're reacting to a stimulus, the male tends to react to positive and dominant cues in those particular regions of the brain. Females tend to respond to cues that lead to submissive reactions in those same brain regions. So slightly different sex outcomes. Emotional experience, they have not found any sex differences across all the different studies that they examined as far as what part of the brain is invoked when a person's experiencing an emotion. And then emotion regulation, this gets really interesting. I was going to mention that while there is no difference in the brain functioning for emotion experience, women do express more emotion with their faces. And that's been observed in people who are watching movies that can evoke emotion. Women tend to be a lot more emotional. They show smiles, they show laughter, they show tears, they show furrowed brows in the middle of sadness, they show more anger when a character is behaving badly, things like that. So you just see way more emotion on a woman viewer than you do in a male viewer when watching movies. We also see that in everyday interactions. Women are much more likely to smile in social situations than males are. It might be a sign of submission. That's one of the things about smiles, is that they can be a big, friendly, confident thing, or they could also be a, hey, don't be mad at me kind of thing. And so women are more likely to smile in general in social situations, particularly in situations where there's like a power differential. Think of work, think of school where you may have to go talk to your professor or something like that. Women are more likely to smile in those situations than men are. So while we see no sex differences in how the brain's function, we do see like different display rules. And so this is where like socialization for sure comes in, right? These different display rules. Although some have argued that these might be evolutionarily selected for also, they might be adaptive. That, for example, women who smile in a situation that could be construed as, a power differential, that might be a way to soften whatever she's trying to do or accomplish, and make it less likely that the recipient would react in an angry way. And that, female ancestors that did that are in fact our ancestors. The one that didn't, they may have been, harmed, and not our ancestors. And so it might be adaptive. It might be something, it might be display rules that we've learned. The last category would be emotion regulation. And what's really interesting here is that you'll see that the increase in activity is really in all the regions, right? You got the frontal lobe with a black upward arrow, the parietal lobe with a black upward arrow, the temporal lobe with a black upward arrow. So for males, all of these areas get activated. They increase in activity, and you don't see those areas being increased in the female brain. The only place you see the female brain showing increased activity is in the limbic system / subcortical region, right? So in these very low level areas when they're attempting to regulate emotion. But what's the most interesting is that the only downward arrow we see in this whole thing is the males during emotion regulation show deactivation in their limbic system cortical region, which may help them to regulate negative emotion. Right? That might help them to not display sadness, not display fear, not display anger, right? So those negative emotions tend to get dampened in males, like at least the projection of them. So it doesn't necessarily mean they don't experience the emotion, because you see all these other areas of the brain that are activated. But this limbic system, subcortical region, helps to keep, their heart rate down, helps to keep their sympathetic nervous system from kicking in and making them want to fight or flee. So that's a really important sex difference right there. All right, I'm going to show you these side-by-side comparisons, and these are both from just very recent news stories I pulled from this week. In both cases, we have a parent whose daughter is missing and the status is unknown. So we have mom on the left and we have dad in the white t-shirt in the middle on the right. So I did not record the sound because, like Ekman says, a lot of times what the person's saying distracts us and causes us not to really be looking at the facial expression. So let's check out mom. It's like a 45-second video. Let's see how she looks. Sorry, I copied it off of YouTube. So I think you can see that she's experiencing what Ekman calls anguish, right? You see that her face is full of fear, sadness. Her eyebrows are up in the middle. I'm going to try and grab her again real quick. Her eyebrows are up in the middle. See all those wrinkles at the top of her forehead as she's talking. See how her lips are turning down, even while she's trying to hold it together. See how she gets the dimpling on her chin. Now I want you to notice that her eyebrows go up, right? Her lips take different shapes. See how she's got her nose kind of pulled up, right? She's got the nasal labial folds. She's trying to hold it together, but not very well, but she's trying, right? And she's making a plea for, if you've just walked away, daughter, come home. If someone has taken you, bring her home. She's making that plea. This father, one thing I have to say is that he had two daughters go missing they fell into the Mississippi River, and one of the bodies has already been found. So he may have less hope than the mom does. So it's not a completely apples to apples comparison, but let's see dad's appearance as he's pleading for his daughter to be found. Those are pictures of the daughter. He's got all of his friends there to support him. So like I said, his other daughter was found. So it's possible he has less hope. And that might be one of those variables that makes it less likely that he would show the extent of anguish that the mom is showing. But it's, if we look at his facial expression with it muted, it's really impossible to know what he's talking about. Except for that all of his friends are there to support him. And at times his friend's hand rubs his shoulder, right, to give him a little bit of support. So he's holding it together, but boy, he's holding it together better than the mom is. And, these are two different daughters that we're talking about, two different situations. But it's kind of a good example of how even as she's trying to hold it together and make this plea, her emotions are showing very clearly on her face. And even as he's making this plea that if you know where she is, if you've seen her, daughter, if you're hearing me, his face is not showing as much. And it's just a really good example of how it's kind of easy to see the difference between males and females in how much and to what degree and so on that they express emotion. And it's not on purpose, but it may be because of that subcortical region in males sort of helps to dampen that kind of reactivity so that he can kind of hold it together. He may have walked away and burst into tears for all we know, right? But he held it together. She was barely not crying during the whole thing. Like her voice, it's clear. I didn't let you hear it, but it's clear that she's about to cry. So it's just, this may be because of maybe display rules or because of how our brains function, one of the reasons why we feel like women are more emotional than men, like that might be one of the reasons why we hold that stereotype, is that, when women are experiencing an emotion, they tend to reveal it more. Males may have a little leg up in this department as far as their brain helps them to not display as much, especially on negative emotions. If we were talking about positive emotions, there wouldn't be anything to say. Males and females display happiness, they display pride, they display all the positive emotions very similarly. All right, this is a good place to stop. And we will come back to talk about how males and females attribute emotions differently.